Hi there, and welcome to the Going Mental podcast. My name's Clint Adams, and I guess just give you some idea of the format of what this podcast is about. A little while ago, I wrote a book which was called Lighting the Blue Flame, and the purpose of that book was really about helping people with, who had mental health problems or issues that, they couldn't necessarily deal with. And part of the book, it was literally about helping kids who have been bullied and how they can become more resilient, but also at the same time look at different ways that we could kind of prevent that as well, so that other kids aren't necessarily teasing these kids or doing things in a way that can lead to someone not feeling great about themselves for a number of reasons, and this can also contribute to that. So a lot of that book involved a fair bit of research of my own, talking to different people that have had issues. I've also worked as a counsellor in the past, and I've also done a fair bit of studies in the psych and counselling area. So, over the years, working with lots of people in a lot of HR roles and helping people with mental health, helping people with mental health first aid who don't necessarily know what to do, and all that sort of stuff came about, and that's how the book kind of culminated in that a couple of years ago. That said, so the purpose of this podcast is not dissimilar. It's about kind of getting more messages out there, but also looking at a number of different ways that we can feel more comfortable discussing certain issues. Also putting perspective in terms of, why some people might react a different way just based on, their background, their beliefs and that kind of stuff. A lot of times people get into a lot of arguments and issues with other people because they have an opinion on something that might be different to theirs. And so just kind of really stepping through some of those, having some of those discussions as part of this podcast around getting that perspective on stuff. I mean, I use just one example where, if you talk about transgender, for example, a lot of people may be quite comfortable that, equality is exactly what should happen. And look, this isn't just my opinion, but ultimately, it's about kind of exploring what those opinions can look like. Obviously, a lot of people think that way, and it's probably the way it should be. But essentially, if you take into context someone else's background, where they've been brought up not to believe in that, they've been brought up that there's men and women only, and that's kind of the only way to go, and so their view would be very different. On top of that, someone who is very comfortable with equality might be a female swimmer, for example, who's been doing years and years of training, and now suddenly, while they might support that, they might have a different view that they do all this training, someone transgenders over as a female and identifies as a female, and now they're suddenly faster than them and getting more accolades about that, and that fairness perception now changes just based on their own personal kind of situation. So there's a lot of different things that we can certainly talk about and really focus on how that kind of affects you as a person and how you deal with those things. And I think that's important. I don't think we necessarily do that well as a society around helping people to be able to discuss and have dialogue about these issues. A lot of times people feel uncomfortable having the conversation, or they feel fearful that they're going to get, their name put out there as being a racist or being against a certain gender equality, and that might not necessarily be the case. But at the same time, it's also important that we're having the discussions. When we don't have discussions, there's usually a safety issue around having those. And so part of this podcast is about not just looking at mental health as a thing, but looking at it how it, as an individual, yes, it affects you as a person. There's a lot of things that affect how you process things, how you deal with things, how fair you think things are, can also have a massive impact on what you perceive, how you react in situations. And then also the social things and the people around you have a massive impact on all of those things as well. So I guess the format of this, Going Mental, I use that name for a reason. One is there's a view that, going mental is, kind of exploding and losing it type of thing. But on the other side is going mental also about feeling comfortable to talk about going mental. Let's talk about that. Let's explore that. Let's explore the humanity of how we interact, how we respond to things. We're allowed to get angry, allowed to get, upset, that kind of stuff. But how we deal with it is kind of a key component to doing it better. And not seeing really, really big, overt negative reactions, and rather being able to deal with things in a much more formal, probably not the right word, but in a more calm it down, let's see what we can do, how we come up with better solutions, understanding how our brain works, how we can use that knowledge of how our brain works in certain situations, and then come up with solutions, come up with opportunities to discuss things that might be bothering people. It's better to hear from people and people going underground, saying things in the background that don't necessarily help, societies, groups, people, all that kind of stuff, and it affects people's behaviours and relationships along the way. Okay, so in a nutshell, the way the format will work going forward is, obviously I'm your host. For those that obviously don't know me, I worked as a police officer for many years down in Victoria, then worked as a counsellor for a private company and for the police later on. And part of my role through that process was, dealing with police and other people who had psychological issues as part of whether it was an injury or being bullied or all that kind of stuff. Obviously, sometimes you have a physical injury, and that has, mental health connotations for you. If you lose a leg, for example, you don't feel yourself as the person that maybe you once were. You can see the limitations that puts on you, all that kind of stuff. So how that process as a part of my role was to help people to deal with that, focus on, different things and see how we could kind of deal with it. And you would see different patterns of how people would go there. I had one guy in particular, had his leg amputated, and he basically was a shell of the person that he was prior to that injury. Couldn't deal with what he couldn't do anymore, couldn't deal with how people would view him as a person now with a disability. So he really went and struggled with it from a PTSD perspective. Then on the other hand, another person, similar kind of injury, also had an amputated leg, and within months this guy really focused on wanting to get in the Special Olympics, wouldn't let this hold him back. So his whole mindset, the ability to use a certain part of the brain was so much better, and he was able to overcome those things. It was still a disability, but the way he viewed it and the way he attached, meaning to what he could do and where he focused his energy was a massive difference in terms of how these two people dealt with that particular issue. So, part of this process is to really focus on that. When I did a lot of the research for the book, I was talking to people who had terrible experiences, had real adversity. Some have been very close to being suicidal, had even attempted suicide. And so, they were able to tell their story, and thankfully, something had happened that changed that course of them not going through with the suicide or being found in time, but then they didn't go and try it again. A lot of times we have this perception that if someone's tried it once, they'll try it again. That's not necessarily true. There's a lot of stats that show things a little bit differently, that if someone intervenes and then things can be rectified, if you want to call it that, then you see a different pathway. And so part of this whole process and part of this whole podcast is to kind of just look and explore different ways that we can do things. There's definitely a lot of ways to the top of this mountain, and some of it's very individualized for you, because no person has the same background, no person has the same exact experience as another person. So it's good to understand your little variations, but also understanding how you're reacting in those instances based on what's going on, being comfortable that you go, okay, I've got to deal with this. Humanity is very broad, right? We talk about profiles like serial killer profiles, but also profiles of people in general, that we kind of like people to fit in a nice, neat category. But that's not the case, right? There's different situations. You might react differently. I mentioned the transgender one before. As a male athlete, that mightn't bother you because it doesn't affect you directly. If you've got, another person coming in as a transgender, doesn't. But if you're looking to go into the Olympics and you've got a transgender male versus transgender female, it opens up a lot of connotations and questions about fairness for that person. So those things can make a massive impact on how you perceive the event, how you then treat other transgender people from that time. So all these things have a massive impact in terms of what can happen. Okay, so as I said, the format will go something like this. I'll hopefully have some, I'm going to try and get athletes. I've got access to some really high-level athletes that hopefully we can kind of talk about mindset, how they get themselves ready for events, how they deal with maybe not winning or not performing as well as they how they maybe deal with injuries when they're really, really close and then there was a letdown or something like that. And so understanding how people deal with it. We're all people, we all have different ways, but similar ways that we can deal with things. And so understanding a lot of that is a real key part of this whole podcast process. What I would like to do is when I start them, I'm going to do this segment which I call FAF, which is funny as, and then you can put the whatever word you want to use for the second F in there, but it's your funniest kind of story, or a story that brings up humour. One of the good things about talking about mental health and talking about health in general is, humour is a big part of us as human beings. When we're laughing, we're feeling great. There's, when they scan your brain and you're actually having humorous things happen, then you're feeling good about life. And so we don't want to stop humour, we also want to understand how that can affect what we do. If I have a joke, you're the butt of someone's joke, very different to just general humour. So understanding a lot of those things is really important, and it'll be good to discuss those as we go along through the next few episodes. So in a nutshell, I want to kind of look at increasing some knowledge on how the brain works. I've run red brain, blue brain stuff you might have seen in some of my previous kind of episodes, which isn't related to it's not part of this particular series, but it kind of sets a tone for understanding how the amygdala, red brain as I call it, and how your prefrontal cortex kind of can work together to one, it sets off an alarm, and the other one is about how you then deal with that alarm and how you can either switch it off if it's constant, or doing things that that you need to do to kind of make those things go away, kind of stuff. So big part of that process to do that. So look, in light of how it is, I guess I can tell you my funny as F particular story. So many years, and again, I use this in the context of trying to understand why someone would do what they did, right? So I was a cop in a place called Geelong, which is down in Victoria here in Australia. And in a nutshell, a nightclub was closing at night, 3 a.m, whatever it was, and essentially people are coming out of the nightclub, and I see this guy, and he walks out for some reason. He decides to walk out of a perfectly good hotel which has toilets, and he decides to urinate against the wall right in front of us, right, and in front of lots of other people. So as a cop, you kind of go, oh, really? But at the same time, you kind of like, so we start walking across the road. We're on the opposite side of the road. For whatever reason, he turns around and he has a look behind him when he sees me and my partner walking towards him. Well, he decides he's going to start running. So as he's running, he's still urinating, but he's trying to do up his kind of jeans there. And the next thing you know, he's looking behind him, seeing where we are. We're not really chasing him at all. We're kind of walking towards him because it's not the worst thing that could happen, but it's clearly not good. And so anyway, he decides to run into and there's a hospital right at that stage. There was this hospital next to the nightclub, and they had this chain across the driveway. And next thing you know, because he's looking behind him, he hasn't seen this chain across the driveway, and his legs have hit that, and he's literally gone and done a triple lutz through the air, lands on his head basically, blood all over him. He's laying in his own wee because he's just like that. He's got, his face is all busted up, and he looks up at us, and he's just literally like, oh, you're not going to arrest me, are you? And so, our view was, well, sorry, mate, for that kind of entertainment, we're just going to drive you home. So we took the poor bugger home. But, if you look at it in context, I mean, it sounds funny to tell the story now, and certainly when it happened, it was quite, funny to see. But, this is like a misfortune. This guy's now injured himself. Not the worst, but, probably brought it on himself, a bit drunk, blah, blah, blah. But when you think of it in terms of behaviour, like, why didn't he go to the toilet inside? These are all questions that you go, right? Either he's drunk, didn't think of it, oh, now I need to go. So, again, context and kind of understanding human behaviour. Part of this podcast is not just about focusing on mental health, but focusing on human behaviour, because that contributes to our mental health. How we behave, how others behave to us, have a massive impact on what we do, what we don't do in certain circumstances, what we don't say. Like saying something is certainly an action, but also not saying something when you're in your head, you're going, hang on, I shouldn't be saying something here because I could get into trouble, or people are not going to like what I say. And understanding that is also part of, sometimes when people don't say things, they get really upset with themselves because they go, damn it, I should have done this or I should have done that. And so part of this podcast will also focus on little events like that where we might pick apart, what situation you were in, why you didn't say what you said, or why you did say it in a way that was a big outburst, and obviously the reaction that other people have, and kind of break that apart a little bit and understand a little bit more about, how we can deal with those things, how how we can change some of those things, how we can get better at maybe, just calming. Sometimes people say a lot of things in anger. As a cop, many times you'd see the aftermath of someone, completely losing it, so to speak, and having a violent reaction or an aggressive reaction because of something that's happened. Someone looked at someone's girlfriend and bang, it turned into something huge. And so, there's lots of these little instances where we look back on what was an overreaction, and we can use real life events around that, stuff like the Black Lives Matter issue when George Floyd was killed. Just looking at that as a process, and as an ex-cop and stuff that I used to do with programs with the police around what we call tactical disengagement, there's a lot of questions that come up just looking at that. There were a number of police all around this guy. They could see he was clearly no longer a threat. He's being sat on, basically. He's cuffed. It's like, when you analyse it and when you end up in court and they overanalyse all those events, you're wondering, why isn't the other cop saying, hey, Dave, get off the bloke. He's all right. He's not going to take on 5 cops and handcuffed. So a number of things could have happened differently. And so sometimes understanding the whole situation, America's very different to Australia. So I'm not saying, having been a cop and having had a person come at me with a knife as a cop, the heart rate definitely goes up, and I can tell you, as they say, the old sphincter's going a bit crazy. But understanding and being able to, in that moment, kind of deal with that a lot better. Understanding how you react, understanding as their partners or the other cops that were there, how are you helping your mate in that situation, and really, looking and kind of picking apart different things and coming up with different solutions is part of what this podcast is about. It's not just about talking about mental health and focusing on it from a counselling perspective, because for me, we know the model of counselling, right? It's a one-on-one generally, not all, but essentially it's one-on-one. It's quite expensive. There's a big gap between, come and see the counsellor every day. It's usually a couple of weeks, 4 weeks sometimes even 3 months apart. And so understanding that, that model is not the only thing we can use. It's about how we socialise, how we interact and talk. And I think, there's a lot of good podcasts, a lot of good books out there that address that. And so part of what I'm trying to do is exactly in the same vein, where the more I can get people talking about what the issues are for them, the more they can kind of put themselves into other people's shoes before they may have a reaction. All those kinds of things are really about, how we frame this up, how we want this to look going forward. And, ultimately, if I get the right guests in who can open up that a bit more and people can relate to them as, athletes that they know, athletes that they maybe even aspire to be like, and get an understanding that what happens in the background in that space is such a key part of what we want to do here. So looking really forward to doing more on this. Keep I guess watching out for them. I'll do this as a proper series, start to bring some people in, and hopefully we can have a great show. Thank you. Bye.